Hi, welcome to session 3, where we're looking at the relationship between energy and the environment and social nexus. What we'll firstly introduce are the human well-being indices and looking at how the quality of life and energy are linked, and therefore the relationship between quality of life and CO2 emissions and what this might mean on transitioning to a lower CO2 economy. Human well-being, quantifying it is a difficult concept. GDP per capita is an indicator that has been used, but there are shortcomings to this, and the Human Development Index, or HDI, was developed, which is a composite of 3 dimensions of human well-being. The dimensions are life expectancy at birth, and this is to assess long and healthy life; education, which you'd like to measure perhaps the expected years of schooling to look at the knowledge of the younger generation, and the average years of schooling to assess the knowledge of the older generation, and then gross national income per capita to assess the standard of living. These indices, which include health, education, and standard of living, are combined in different ways in different indices, but they're all trying to measure quality of life by a number. If we look at the Human Development Index, looking at World Online in Data, what we see is the lowest Human Development Index is at 0, and it increases to 1, so it's number between 0 and 1. And the highest countries, which sit in an index between 0.9 and 1, are Australia, much of Europe, and North America. South Africa sits here at between 0.6 and 0.7, and some countries in Africa, some of the lowest, around about the 0.3 level. And from this, you can sort of see countries in Africa at the moment have, on average, the lowest HDI indices, whereas the developed countries have the highest. What we'd like to have a look at now is how this Human Development Index is affected by energy. But before we go to that, we can look and see how the Human Development Index changed from 1980 to 2017. And I've got a few countries up here. South Africa is this, let me double check I give you the right one, this red line over here. And you can see we've had a sort of bit of an up and down. At times, probably this down over here is around about 2005, which is probably the HIV epidemic and the high death rates we were having, which would have dropped our life expectancy. China sitting over here, and they started off much lower than South Africa, and they've just continued on an upward trend. United States and Norway sitting up here above 0.8, tending to 1. And the Democratic Republic of Congo, in 1980, the HDI was just below 0.4, and now in 2017 is a little bit above 0.4. Was pretty stagnant for 20 years and has started to increase. India, we also see, started from a very low base, very close to that of the DRC, and has been climbing steadily over the last 40 years. The Historical Index of Human Development, or HIHD, is a measure of human development from 1870 onwards. It's also based on a similar premise to that of the HDI, and it's looking at an index that varies between 0 and 1 that tries to assess the same 3 dimensions: a long, healthy life, access to knowledge, and a decent standard of living. So it weights life expectancy at birth, adult literacy, educational enrollment rates, and it uses GDP per capita to assess standard of living. Looking at our World in Data, they have correlated the Historical Index of Human Development from 1870 over here all the way to 2015. South Africa is this one over here. Again, we see this dip when probably mainly due to decreased life expectancy during the early stages of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. There's China, fairly constant progress, but you see starting from a very low base in 1870. South Korea, you can see, has been quite amazing how it has just been on this upward trend, and its HDI has human index of historical index of human development has surpassed that of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the United States, the United Kingdom are typically on a fairly constant upward trend, starting at about 0.2 in 1870, and now just under 0.8. Now, we're looking particularly at how these indices relate to energy. And this graph over here looks at the relationship between energy consumption on the x-axis and on the y-axis HDI. And this is looking in 2017. And it's taken from the BP Energy Outlook report. And what one finds is there's a fair amount of scatter, but you could put a curve through it. And what one finds is countries with low HDI certainly have very low energy consumption per capita, as you can see. But there's no guarantee as you increase your energy consumption above a certain amount that will correspond to an increasing HDI. So, for example, here we have a country using close to 500 gigajoules per person with an HDI of a 0.8, and similarly here with about 0.8 or below, at about 100 kilojoules, so about a fifth of the energy. So although at low energy consumption, there is low HDI, a very good correlation. As one gets to sufficient energy, it doesn't necessarily mean that using more energy improves quality of life. About 80% of the world's population sits below the 100 gigajoules per person. And we could ask, what is the difference between a country that has an HDI of 0.8 using 100 gigajoules and one that's using 400 gigajoules per person with the same HDI? And perhaps it's not just at this level of higher energy use, it's not just increasing the supply of energy that's important, but rather using that energy on productive activities that improve GDP, improve education, and improve health. This graph, again from Our World in Data, looks at the energy consumption per person, and we see South Africa is actually pretty high in our energy consumption, sitting in this sort of range here from about 25 to 50 kilowatt hours per person. What the 100 gigajoules per head from the previous graph correlates to about 28 kilowatts per head, kilowatt hours per head, I should say, which is sitting in this dark orangey sort of area before it goes into the red. And you see South Africa is sort of sitting in that, much of China, but Africa and some of South America here are sitting below that required amount, and much of Indonesia area here. So what we see is the Human Development Index correlates somewhat with energy consumption, and certainly a certain amount of energy is needed in order to improve the HDI. But is it to do with improving life, quality of life, education, or what about GDP? And if we look at HDI correlated versus GDP, firstly, I must warn you, this is a log axis. No, this isn't. This is a log axis over here. Sorry, it is a log axis. That distance there is a change of $50,000 per GDP, and that's a distance there is 2,000. So this is a log axis on this scale, not on this scale. And here are various countries for 2017. And what one finds is there certainly is a fairly strong link between GDP and Human Development Index. Countries up here, for example, United States, Japan, have fairly high GDPs per capita and high HDIs. Countries down here, Burundi, Chad, Niger, Malawi, both fairly low HDI and low GDP per capita. And so it would seem as if one is going to be increasing the supply of energy to a country, it must be put into useful activities, such as increasing GDP and not wasted. For example, if you have a heater on in a household all day, you use a lot of electricity, but it's not going to actually add value to life after a certain amount. So somehow, as we increase the energy to supply to communities, this has to be used for business and for activities that generate GDP. But how does this link now with HDI index increasing and CO2 emissions? Again, this is from Our World in Data, looking at HDI, and on the y-axis is the annual consumption-based CO2 emissions per capita. And what one sees is generally there is a trend as HDI increases, there are more CO2 emissions. But again, what we find is there's a great spread. So let's start low down here. Countries with low HDI also have low annual, and this is consumption-based CO2. So in other words, it doesn't take production into account. If you import something and use it, it goes into your consumption-based CO2. So countries like Ethiopia, Uganda, low HDI, low CO2, presumably because of low energy consumption. China is sitting here with fairly high HDI compared to its CO2 per capita. There's South Africa. You can see we have slightly more CO2 per capita production in China, but our HDI is about 1.15 lower than China. So it's Chile. There's China. And United States sitting up there. But notice at the same value of HDI, say from 0.9, at about a nice value of high value of 0.9, you have France here with 6 to 7 tons of CO2 per capita, all the way up to, well, here Qatar with a lower GDP and much higher HDI, I should say, and much higher CO2 production per capita. And so again, when you get into the high end of the energy consumption, there's a lot more scatter, again, depending on how energy efficient the country is. So looking at future development, in the past, improving the quality of life of people led to an increase in energy consumption per capita and a subsequent increase of CO2 emissions per capita. And the question we could now ask is, how do we increase the quality of life for the poorest and for developing countries and yet not increase CO2 emissions? And in fact, it's not just not increasing CO2 emissions. Indeed, globally, we have to decrease CO2 emissions. And has that happened? And if we look at per capita CO2 emissions for various countries, if we see the United Kingdom over here, this is starting in the 1750s. As they went through their industrial revolution, it increased markedly, some drops due to wars and so on. But what you see here is that United Kingdom has decreased its CO2 emissions per capita quite significantly in the last 20 to 30 years. Some of it from by moving presumably from a coal-based economy to a gas-based economy, and some of it from improving energy efficiency. China, which is this green curve here, has been increasing considerably over the last 50 years. And what they are looking to, as we saw in the video, is reaching maximum CO2 emissions in the next 10 to 15 years and bringing their CO2 emissions per capita down. Australia has been decreasing, United States has been decreasing, and South Africa, we have also been decreasing, as you can see here. But I think, unfortunately, that is due to the fact that we have less energy to consume because of Eskom's problems, not because we've improved energy efficiency directly. So looking at CO2 emissions by region and income level, what we see is high income regions, which have 16% of the world's population, consume, or if you look at their share of consumption-based CO2 emissions, they produce about 46% of the CO2 emissions. And so it really is, high-income countries are by far disproportionately producing CO2. Your upper middle income countries, of which about 35% of the world's population sits there, they're responsible for about 41% of CO2-based emissions, so slightly more than what their population would suggest. But what is interesting is their share of production-based CO2 emissions is much higher than what their population would percentage would suggest, meaning these are the countries which are actually manufacturing, improving quality of life by creating businesses which export. In contrast, the low-income countries, of which about 9% of the world's population, are only responsible for about 4% of consumption-based CO2 emissions, but also only responsible for about 4% of production-based CO2 emissions. So in these countries, there's not much manufacturing happening, and this is sort of where they're stuck in that not enough energy, not enough business, not enough GDP being created to drive wealth creation. Looking at South Africa in terms of our CO2 emissions by fuel type, the grey is coal, and we can see we're very much a coal-based economy with some dips because of the Eskom problems. Oil is the blue. Gas, we have very little, and cement, very little. And so most of our emissions are from our coal, which, as we've seen previously, is used for mainly electricity production, 70% for that, and 30% for conversion to liquid fuels in the Sasol process. If we look at where we generate greenhouse gas emissions by sector in South Africa, this is the 2019 data, electricity and heat are responsible for the majority of our CO2 emissions at about just close to 5 tons of greenhouse gas emissions per person. Transport, about 1 ton. Manufacturing, construction, smaller, and all the way down to industry, aviation, and shipping, and land use changes being the smallest contributors. So if we want to drop our CO2 emissions per capita, these are the two sectors we've got to look at: transport and electricity and heat. And so what we have to look at is generating more electricity, supporting transport, but in ways that don't generate CO2, because we have to produce more energy, but consume it in businesses and improve energy efficiency in businesses so that this energy is used as effectively as possible to increase GDP. If we look globally at sources of greenhouse gas emissions, what we see is the blue here is energy, the sources, the production of CO2 from energy. We're looking from 1990 to about 2016, and worldwide, the energy sector is the biggest producer of CO2. Agriculture is this light green, and it's remained pretty constant. Industry, the red, and it has been increasing. Waste, that black brown area, again has stayed pretty constant, but it is perhaps something we could look at to reduce, use the waste more effectively, dispose of it more effectively. Land use and forest, and the sort of dark green is fugitive emissions. Looking at the carbon emissions for energy use, in other words, this blue sector, which are the sectors in the energy use, in this energy or use this energy, we can see here from this, and this is for 2018 globally. The blue over here is transport. Aviation is responsible for about 3%, marine 2%, medium and heavy road 5%, other transport is 14%. And that is, I think, why there's this emphasis to go to electric vehicles, using renewable energy to generate the electricity, which would impact that 14% of the energy sector. Looking at buildings, we see heating of buildings and commercial buildings are about 5% of our CO2 emissions. Other residential and commercial buildings, 21%, and so improving buildings is a big driver. Light industry, 24%, heavy industry, 13%, cement manufacture, 14%, and iron and steel is about 6%. And so all of these, you can see where the big hits are and where the focus is in trying to reduce CO2 emissions associated with that energy use. Now, modeling global energy systems and CO2 emissions going forward, various groups have different scenarios, and I'll look at the BP scenarios. They look at the rapid transition, which policy measures lead to increases in carbon prices. More specific measures are implemented, resulting in carbon emissions falling about 70% by 2050. This is consistent with limiting global temperature rises to less than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels by 2100. Net zero is a more stringent policy which assumes measures are put in place and which are reinforced by shifts in society behavior and preferences, which further accelerates reduction of CO2 emissions. Global CO2 emissions fall by over 95% by 2050, which is consistent to limiting the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C. And business as usual, which assumes policies, technology, social preferences continue to evolve in a manner as we've seen over the recent past. Progress in reducing CO2 emissions is slow, and energy emissions in 2015 are less than 10% below those of 2018. Depending on how we transition, this is our CO2 emissions from energy use, and we're sort of around about over here at the moment, just under 35 gigatons of CO2. If we continue with business as usual, maybe it drops to about 30 gigatons by 2050. Rapid, you can see we'd have to drop in the next 30 years down to about 10 gigatons, and net zero, we've got to get reduced from 35 close to zero. And I suppose it's our choice of our going forward, the businesses our businesses, our governments, our society, which of these scenarios we're going to follow and where in these sort of ranges we're going to lie. This is again the BP model looking at developing and emerging countries, their kind of prediction, looking at US tons, the average carbon prices in developed and emerging regions. What they see is that if we go to rapid zero, there'll be less carbon taxes on emerging countries, and more strongly taxed CO2 emissions would be more strongly taxed on developing countries. This to give emerging countries a break to develop their industries, while developing countries will have a very strong push to move to renewable energy. In terms of business as normal, there's still a break for emerging countries, but CO2 emissions wouldn't be taxed particularly. And these are the various scenarios for how energy use would change by source. And you can see the drop depending on whether you go for rapid, net zero, or business as usual. Drop in oil from current in the rapid and net zero, roughly the same if we go to business as usual. But where the growth is in the renewables, which is this orange block over here. That's where the big growth will be. Net zero, a significant growth, more than half of our energy coming from renewables, hydro taking up the rest, and nuclear, an expansion of nuclear from current. Both the rapid and net zero look at expansion of nuclear, and gas between current and rapid, pretty much the same, but a big drop in net zero. Business as usual, we use more fossil fuels, that's all our fossil fuels, or I suppose we'd say roughly the same, and a small increase in nuclear and some increase in renewables, but not as much as what's needed to get the CO2 emissions down significantly. However, it's not just the amount of energy one consumes. The quality of the energy supply is also very important. This is again from BP, based on World Bank definitions of different tiers of electricity. But for example, tier 3 electricity, which is this over here, is where the access is less than 16 hours of interrupted power access during the day and less than 4 hours during the night. And so this is sort of where you have power, but it's on and off. I think we can kind of understand that. Tier 1 and 2 is even, more interrupted power, and tier 5 would be fairly continuous supply of electricity or energy. And the color schemes here are the size of the block is proportional to the populations. The blue here are high income countries, the yellow upper middle income, the orange lower middle income, and the purple low income. And what one also sees then, it's not just the annual consumption that's important, but also how consistent the energy supply is. In other words, interruptions are a problem with GDP. And so here, for example, if you look at countries, just look over here where, let's look over, where can we look? Where we have this same energy consumption, what you see is that if we're wanting to increase GDP, generally it's related to better quality of energy, which makes sense. It's hard to run businesses when the electricity supply is on and off, as we've seen. And so it's having consistent energy that's available on demand is very important for increasing GDP. So going forward, the implications for moving from a coal-based economy to renewable energy from South Africa is we've got to look at supplying energy which is less CO2 intensive. We've got to look at improving the quality of energy in that it is reliable. Load shedding is not good for GDP. And basically, there's a very strong link between GDP and Human Development Index, or in other words, the quality of life. And so all of these factors have to be looked at if we are going to improve the quality of life for South Africans. Thank you.